Great. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our second conversation in the series that we've put together to launch Kainos. It's really good to see all of you on here. If you're able to turn your camera on, fantastic. We can get a sense of who's in here. Maybe also, if you feel like it, go into gallery view, see if there's new faces, familiar faces. Just nice to sort of come into contact with each other as we do this. So we're joined today by the wonderful Nora Bateson, who I'm going to introduce properly in a moment. But I wanted to just kind of place these conversations and this conversation in particular. The reason I wanted to do these is because I have a sense, and a lot of people I've spoken to over the last months have a sense that we're really in new territory now, culturally, politically, economically, and with, of course, the election of Trump in the US. But I think that's also a symptom of a much deeper shift in the really a sense that the old system is dying. And by the old system, I mean the liberal world order that arose, particularly after World War II, this sense of a kind of large global community and a pursuit of a particular kind of progress, a progress based on very humanistic values of a kind of generalized sense of human well-being, decoupled from the land, decoupled from local economies, instead going to a large sort of global economy. Now, Brexit was a moment here in Europe, or in the UK in particular, where there was a rejection of this that worldview. The first election of Trump, I think, was a rejection of that worldview as well. And I think the second election of Trump is the death of that worldview in many ways. And so, in my view, what we're in now is kind of a world between worlds. And I was thinking before this session that the last time I did this many live Zoom sessions with the community was during COVID, which was, and some of you were there. I can see a lot of familiar faces, which is really cool. And that really was also a time between worlds. And we actually talked a lot in those sessions about the Greek word kairos, which is, the Greeks, were better at language than us English speakers, I think, and had multiple words for concepts as big as time and novelty, etc. And kairos is a sense of time that's different to chronos, which is linear, but it's a time between worlds, a sort of pregnant present moment where anything can happen. And COVID felt a bit like that for many of us, right? And I think we're in a moment like that again. Kainos, with an N, is around a particular kind of novelty, a newness that hasn't been before, compared to neos, the other Greek word for novelty, for newness, which is just new in time. So I have a sense that we're in completely new territory, and it's a time of great upheaval and chaos and potential destruction, and also a time of potential hope, imagination, expansion. And I have a sense as well that there's an opportunity now for a new counterculture to emerge. I'm kind of the opinion, and this isn't my idea, but it's one that's been floating around, that there hasn't been a counterculture in the West for the last sort of 20 years, right? Maybe since the kind of grunge Gen X era. Culture has been very conformist. It's been very repetitive. If anyone saw my piece, The Novelty Famine, last year, that's kind of my stance on it, that we are kind of endlessly repeating, like Baudrillard, the philosopher, said, just symbol after symbol that just kind of endlessly repeats without actually pointing to something real anymore. And the internet has enhanced that a lot. So if that's the case, then this moment we find ourselves in, despite the fact that is also defined by this return to kind of a dark traditionalism as well, and a kind of form of fascism, which is something that I think we need to address and move away from. If we can do that, I think we have the opportunity to create the seeds of a counterculture in many different areas that actually move beyond the polarities that we've been stuck in for so long. Now, that's kind of where my thinking's at now. And so the reason I wanted to do all these conversations is because I'm, like many of us, probably all of us, in a position where like I don't actually know what does that actually look like. What is the next step in that? How do we move forward? And the overarching conversation, or the overarching question rather, in all these conversations is, where do we go next? And so, having said that, Nora, I want to bring you into the conversation now. And firstly, just to say welcome, and that it's lovely to have you. I would say back, but this is a new project, so it's lovely to have you here. Good to see you. Um, and Nora, I mean, so Nora is a really pivotal figure in the worlds of systems change and complexity studies and many other areas. It's kind of hard to pin you down, Nora, because I think your work spans a lot of areas. But what I really appreciate, one of the things I really appreciate about your work is that you look at the systems we're in not as kind of machines that you can plot on a graph, but as living, learning processes. And I think that's really essential for right now. And I thought we could begin with this concept of, firstly, do you agree that one system is dying at the moment? And if you do, what does that actually mean? Like, what happens when a system sort of stops working?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question. What we're talking about, I think, really is a form of evolution. And that systems, when I'm talking about systems, I'm talking about multiple relationships in multiple contexts that are interdependent, but that interdependency is not frozen. Okay, so it's easy to think of interdependency like a big Swiss watch. It's not, because all the organisms are changing in response to each other. So the first thing that I want to do in response to that question is really to go back for a second and think about the difficulties that the last couple hundred years of understanding of our world through the lens of modernity and industrialism, etc., that those ways of perceiving and those habits actually make it very difficult to perceive the movement of multiple relationships changing in multiple directions simultaneously. So if you look at any organism in a meadow or a forest or anywhere else, that organism is going to be in lots of different kinds of relationships. I mean, you as a humanoid are in lots of different kinds of relationships. You have a relationship with your kids. You have a relationship with your ancestors. You have relationships with your partner, with your work, with your microbiome, with your community, with your culture, with your language, right? And all of these relational communicational processes are shifting. Your relationship with your kids changes your relationship with how you perceive your ancestors. Your relationship with your ancestors changes how you perceive a change in culture. Your relationship with culture changes how you perceive maybe, the seasons or your food or your health. Your health changes how you perceive your government or your economy so all these different contexts of relationship are changing each other. And this, for me, this has always been the piece around systems thinking that is most difficult to convey, because it's the piece where people think, oh, yeah, but that just makes my head explode. How am I supposed to keep track of all of those changes in all those directions all the time? I just need to go to work on Monday. I just need to know what to do. I need a methodology, a format, a plan, a goal. And this, of course, causes all sorts of consequences. And the consequences cause more consequences. And so, in an effort to save time and complication by making it a false sort of reductionist simplicity to begin with, we end up with a whole lot of complex mess. So when you say, what does it mean to be in a system that's dying? What we are looking at is a whole lot of relationships that are changing in front of us, through us, among us, within us, in our language, in our perception, in our diet, in our way of perceiving who we are in the world. In relationship to our ancestors, like the way you perceive the future changes how you perceive the past. So, what does it mean to be in a set of structures that are dying? Now, if you're talking about, first of all, I just want to say that every organism has to come to this. Every organism is in interdependency with a whole bunch of contextual things. A little mouse, right, pokes his nose out one day and he looks around his world and he says, all the things I used to eat, all the ways I used to live have changed. Now I have to live in a new way, and I don't know what that new way is. This is what my dad referred to as a double bind, right? So the way I used to live is deadly. The only way I know to perceive to live is the way that I used to live, and therefore I can only perceive that I'm in a deadly situation. And that feeling is part of the creative imperative of life. It's that moment when, as organisms, we are pushed to be creative, to learn something, to perceive our world in a new way so that we can perceive new possibilities together, I might add, or become obsolete. I mean, the way you get bumped off the evolutionary game board is by not being able to remain in relationship with life. And so I think if we were talking about a meadow and the organisms in a meadow, what would be different is that there isn't any organism in our meadow that believes there's such a thing as reductionism and measurement and a way to be separate from the other organisms. So when we're talking about a system that's dying, I think for me, what I really hear you referring to is that set of epistemological habits. I wanted to show one slide, but I don't know if I have permission to show
You
one.
100% have permission, but what I'm going to do to
Yeah.
enable that is I'm going to make you a co-host, in which
Okay.
then you should be able to do that.
Okay. It's just one little itty bitty little slide. Okay. So this slide is what I wanted to show you today. So these tomatoes, all right, if you forget everything that we talk about today, just be a tomato. These tomatoes, my friend Rex Weiler, who helped start Greenpeace, I was at his house and he said, I got to show you my tomatoes. Look at this. And he went and he got these tomatoes and he said, I picked all of these tomatoes off the same bush on the same day. They were the same size and the same color. Okay, so the day they were picked, they were all small and green. And now they're not. And I want to ask you what, notice for a second what's different about them. What's different about those 4 that are small and green and those 4 that are red and juicy? Where is the learning? Where is the ripening? Where is the shift? Where is the, somebody might use the word development. Where is it? And what you will notice is that the red ones are connected by their stem. They're in communication with each other. How that communication works, I don't know. But they are in relationship and communication. They are actually in some sort of, you can think of it as like an antenna or something, that's actually connecting them. And the ones that are isolated are not receiving the same learning. They're not receiving the same information. they're not changing in the same kind of way at all. So I want to, bring into your discourse here, Ali, the question of what is safety? Because it's a question that I think is ringing everywhere. We're in danger. What makes us safe? What makes us in danger? And um, and to recognize in these tomatoes how important it is to be in analog contact and communication. There's things happening in analog communication and contact and relationship that we have no idea what they are, so we cannot digitize them. They're outside the reach of our current understandings of any kind of technology. And in that sense, there are ways in which our collective knowing, learning, healing, and evolution are tied together. All right, so that's the one slide that I wanted to share with you.
Absolutely worth it. Thank you.
Okay,
That
good.
was the beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, and looking at that, there's a couple of things I'd love to pick up on. One is there's a great book that came out this year by Zoe Schlanger, who's a journalist and not a biologist, but she got really interested in the question of plant consciousness. She's written this great book about the study of plant consciousness. And one of the things in that book is that even the word consciousness for some scientists in relation to plants is like, you know, toxic. Even the word behavior for some is a massive trigger. But
Mhm,
there's very, very strong evidence. And you looking at that picture, they're linked by the vine, they're in
mhm.
communication, they're in relationship with one another. There's also in The Hidden Life of Trees, which is a bit of an
Right,
older
right.
book, he points that out as well, where he's like, new growth forests, it's like having lots of adolescent trees that aren't connected with each other properly through the root system, and they're all independent units. Whereas in old forest, there's a much deeper sense of interconnectivity and mutual support. And it does feel, that's my sense, is that what we're reaching the end of, as well as a particular political order, is an entire worldview of intense separation, where just the cognitive dissonance of seeing ourselves as separate from one another and seeing everything in the world as distinct units rather than uh, a relational process. I don't think it's true that that's the case. And therefore, I think there's an essence where there's a sense in which the truth will win out, because the universe is clearly a relational process all the way down to the quantum level. This is plenty of quantum theorists will point out, it's a relational universe right down to the very tiniest bits. It's bizarre. Well, it's a really weird situation to be in where there's so much evidence for this, and it's so clear in our own lives that this is the case, that what really matters is the relationships. And when people on their deathbeds, there's all these famous, examples of, we surveyed 100 people on their deathbeds, and the most common that were palliative care nurses told us the most common thing people said is, I wish I'd spent more time on my relationships, with
Mhm.
my family, in relationship. No one says, I wish I'd done more spreadsheets. I'm sure one person, there's always the outlier, right? Um, but yeah, and so I think it's a really important piece to bring in. Now, there's a few more pieces I want to pick up on, particularly the idea of trust. But before we do that, I really want to hear your experience of being in the States, having been in Sweden, and you're now on the west coast of America, post-election, about what, two weeks or so, or not even out. What's your experience of navigating the complexity of all of this?
Well, I'm in a little town that is indistinguishable in its political alignment. So there's a lot of very kind of underground, undercover diversity here. which is to say that no one's waving their flag really. There's a few, with their bumper stickers and this and that, but for the most part, it's a working class community, and no one really knows where anybody else is standing. And so there's a kind of cautiousness around how you talk about it when you meet people. And that caution is very interesting to me because we were just looking at the tomatoes and this idea of communication, right? What's in the communication? And the ways in which the communication, and this came up, in another piece you and I did together, Ali, around the ways in which communication has been wildly distorted by the advertisers, by the legal system, by the politicians, by the media, by social media, by all of these different, to the point where we expect it to be. So what do you do when someone shows up at your door and they're, here to meet you, they're your new neighbor? How do you be in that? And you have no idea where they stand. And they have no idea where you stand. And in this era, we're measuring each other up, right? There's this sense of like, okay, well, she's talking like this. She's probably a leftist, but she's talking like that. And that doesn't fit into that box, right? So increasingly, that's the piece of recognizing there's a real binary set of boxes, but none of the binaries work. So, in order to align with a particular direction, you have to make compromises in your binary position. So there's a lot of people, for example, who were super anti-vax, who have otherwise very leftist views because they were like anti-established medicine, etc. But they suddenly are aligning with the right. And they didn't expect to be aligning with the right in their lifetime. They've never voted Republican in their lives. So then you get in a situation of you have to make excuses or justifications for all the other platforms that you don't agree with so that you can have the sense of aligning with the one you do. And I think this is true pretty much for everybody, that there's a way in which you have to make some justification. Yeah, I think that's all right, but I don't like this. But I'm going to have to take this along because otherwise I will lose belonging. I will lose containment in my particular positioning. So what it's like to be here right now is like people coming to the door and the conversation starting. And the best way I have learned to open that conversation is to say, I don't trust any of the politicians. And when we start there, pretty soon we actually are having a conversation there. And immediately people want to know what's happening in Sweden. They want to know what's happening, how I perceive this or that. And I get to be on my own turf. Right? So I am finding that it's not that hard to be a tomato. If I start in another place, I otherwise there is a sense of I mustn't speak, and then I become the isolated tomatoes, right? So in that isolation, that's the loss. So how to be in these relationships that I know if we were, standing next to each other in the voting booth, we might come out very differently. But we're not in the voting booth. We're in my kitchen, or we're in the shop together, or we're in context. We're in life, and life is bigger than the abstraction of that binary. And we're sharing life together. So there's a kind of a tone that I'm beginning to find that basically is saying, hey, those guys, this system, like you were saying, this system, the whole thing is wacko. The legal system doesn't seem to be really working for anybody anymore. The financial system has abandoned everybody but the trillionaires. The health system is corrupted by big pharma's greed. the school system is falling apart in every direction, and the kids are in big trouble, and the blah, 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 blah. And that's where we live. We live in the first and second order consequences of all of those pressures of being in life in every day in a world in which these existing institutions and systems are pixelating in front of our eyes. And it comes out in terms of marriages breaking up, bankruptcies, cancers, addictions, lots of things that you might attribute, and you would say, well, that person just made bad choices. I'm not really buying that right now because pretty much everybody I know has some kind of crisis going on. So I think it's kind of, back to that push of perception of looking at these crises that are in everybody's personal lives that have taken infinite different shapes and forms, and recognizing these are expressions of a multi-system breakdown. And one thing about complexity is that it feels cold and far. It feels academic and mathematical. And what I am always working with in my work, in the worm data work, is that actually complexity is very intimate. It's very, very intimate. What are our appetites? Right? For success, for identity, for sex, for love, for respect, even for food, for health, for relationship. What are the appetites? And where do those appetites then produce actions? And then those actions lead to the next set of consequences. So that you have a lion, and the lion is going through the savannah, and the lion is hungry and sees an antelope and has an appetite for that antelope. What the lion is not thinking about in that moment of appetite is the way in which the relationship between the lion and the antelope helps keep the population of antelopes down enough so that the savanna grasses can grow, so that they hold enough moisture in the soil, so the bacteria in the soil can keep the savanna alive so that the lion has a place to live. But the lion's not thinking about all that stuff. The lion is thinking, I'm hungry. So that question for me of like, what are you hungry for? And where does that hunger go? Because if we are hungry, if we have appetite for relationship to systems that are destructive of these multi-order ongoing processes, that's it for us. And what does that, I mean, this is what I mean, is very intimate. I mean, your appetites are, I mean, you can't tell someone or teach someone or program someone to not have an appetite for this, that, or the other. That's deep stuff. So when we're talking systems change, I think my biggest feeling is don't underestimate what this means. It's not a matter of a new set of rules for the game board. It's not a matter of downloading some, new instructional on how to live in changing times. No, 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 no. You can't approach it from this top-down set of abstract processes. It's deeply physiological. It's physiological. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this touches on something you said earlier, which I think is so important and kind of points to almost a not a tension or maybe a paradox in online communication, because this kind of online communication is probably the best kind we have, right? Where we're live, it's synchronous, we can see each other, we can even be somewhat embodied, right? In-person communication is the best. And the reason it's the best is because I think, well, many reasons, but there's something about, when you were speaking earlier about, complexity, I was thinking about a good analogy, and I thought, well, it has to be lived, and it has to be lived in an intimate way, in a real way. And I thought, the most complex thing in my life is my marriage, That's the
Mhm.
most complexity. It's the deepest, most growth spurring, most complex. Like, and if someone were to say to me, listen, you've got to give, you're going to do 10 Zoom sessions about how to be married. And you're going to get all these experts in. Like, hey, that's not going to, you know what? We might get some good ideas, right? And it might be applicable, but that is not how to be married. How to be married, how to be in a relationship, how to be whatever role is a personal, intimate, flowing, changing process. And so there's something about the need for practice and the need for connection and the need for flow together. And yeah, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about warm data because I think some people will be familiar with it, others won't. But, for me, especially with Kainos, like when I was really feeling into, okay, what is needed right now, I thought, there was a part of me that felt with Rebel Wisdom, we had a community, a really lovely community of practice, but we weren't clear what we were practicing for. And I
Mhm.
think this is endemic to the well-being world in a lot of ways. There's a kind of let's maximize ourselves, but I think the next stage for us in the West, in the systems we're in, is to go, what is outside of us that we can orient to, and how do we use practice to orient to that, right? And so there's something about warm data that I really like because the practice is pointing to something beyond all of us, which is complexity itself, which is the world itself. But maybe you could explain a little bit about like what is warm data practice, how does it work, and why? Why did it feel necessary to bring into the world?
Okay, so I guess one thing that is part of the habit um, of perception that has been so endemic to modernity um, is the habit of thinking that you can talk about something. And this is an interesting problem, right? If I ask you to describe a dream that you had, you will do it. And you will know that your description is inadequate, that you're actually like taking a lot of things that are beyond words and you're either skipping over them or squishing them into a set of words or metaphors that you could make sense to the person you're talking to. Right? You know the feeling, right? You describe a dream, it's you know your description is way off. Um, all right, this is what I have really discovered about working with shifting, changing complex systems, especially in terms of human experience, cognition, and learning, is that a great deal of it that is actually in motion is beyond the place where we can actually talk about it. So the warm data work is, well, first of all, there's two things that I'm talking right now about the warm data labs. And they were developed because I was trying to figure out how to actually deal with the problem of the question of what is information. And I was working with a research question on how systems learn. So which I think is what we're talking about right now, when you say it's dying, I'm going to say what it's actually doing is learning, right? So it's learning that some things are not workable anymore. They don't generate life anymore. Okay, so let's say you're looking at the question of you're playing violin, you're learning to play violin. Where's the learning? Is the learning in the muscles? Is it in the music? Is it in the culture? Is it in the intellect? Is it emotional? Is it in relationship with the teacher? Is it in relationship with the formation and the making of this beautiful instrument? Where's the learning? Okay, so if you broke all those contexts down and you said, I'm going to study how learning violin is emotional, or I'm going to study how it's intellectual, or I'm going to study how it's in the muscles, or I'm going to study how it's in relationship to teacher and communication, or, culture or whatever, you would get a lot of information. But I think you could probably agree with me that when I ask, where is the learning? It's in some combining of those things. And on one day, it might be very intellectual. On another day, it could be very emotional. Oh, also, it could associate into other contexts. You could have an experience in your marriage that really broke your heart and go back to your violin and be able to play things with your muscles that you couldn't play before. You could learn something intellectually in I don't know, in reading a book that then when you come back to the music, you're able to perceive it in a new way and therefore you can express it. Where's the learning? So if we are going to study how systems change, how systems learn, we need a different kind of information that is actually a living, shifting kind of information, right? The information about how it's combining is not compartmentable, it's not measurable, it changes from perspective to perspective. And so this piece of how systems learn was my opening into the question of, in order to study the complexity of life, we need to think about information differently. Because right now, the way that you glean research information is by pulling things out of context, defining them, measuring them, and repeating, this is the scientific method from the 1600s, repeating the exercise so you get the same results. Fair enough. I have nothing against that. It's probably really important to do reductionist research, but it's not the only thing that's happening. And right now, so much of our confusion is around not being able to even practice perceiving in these relational complex ways that actually produce learning and life. So warm data is information that's alive, right? That's moving through multiple contexts. So the warm data lab then is set up so that the human beings in the lab have something to talk about that moves them through multiple contexts, but they need something to talk about. We got to talk about stuff. But even as I'm talking right now, I'm having ideas. You're having ideas. You're having memories. There's a whole lot of other stuff happening that's not on the transcript. You're thinking about memories. You're thinking about, all kinds of stuff that's lighting up different ways of knowing in your body, in your memory, in your story, in your history, in your right. So what the Warm Data Lab is a structured conversation that holds all of this room for talking about stuff that's super generative of lots of things that are not being talked about, lighting up lots of impressions that are crossing and combining and producing new possibilities of perception, which that process, I would argue, is beyond the possibility of controlling, measuring, or producing any kind of predetermined outcome for, and I would never do that. I consider that way in which systemic learning happens to be sacred, and I would never predetermine what the learning should be, but give it lots of room to happen. Give it movement. Give it space. So that's warm data.
Beautiful, beautiful description, Nora. Thank you. Um, this leads into the last thing I want to discuss together before we open the Q&A. And on that note, if you have questions, but I don't want to limit it to just questions. If you have thoughts, if you have expressions that you want to bring into the space, please put them into the chat, and we'll gather them, and then we'll use the rest of the time for those. But there's something that came up for me as you were speaking, Nora, which is that, and I think this is something that I connect with in your work, and that's something that's very close to my heart, which is, if I had to really boil down what I think is needed culturally, spiritually, perspectively right now, it's the shift from the Enlightenment worldview that sees the world as a dead, stale, mechanized place to seeing everything is alive.
Mhm.
Everything. Everything's alive. Now, another way of saying that is animism, right? And my friend Josh Schrei, who people might be familiar with, who does the Emerald podcast, which is a brilliant podcast. If you're not familiar with the Emerald, familiarize yourself. It's really brilliant. But I asked him yesterday, what gives you hope right now? And then he kind of was talking a bit about hope, and he was like, you know what, hope, it's not really the right frame for me. What I really feel connected to is trust. And then he talked about, trust in the world, trust in reality. And I felt that multiple times in the past. I think we're in a meaning crisis, certainly, but I think there's, on a deeper level, a trust crisis. And that trust goes right to the heart of, do we trust that reality is real in some sense? Is it alive, or is it, just kind of a construct, as particular worldviews might put it? But I wanted to just kind of open that as the last thing we talk about before Q&A. For you, what is the role of trust right now? Like, what does that word bring up for you? Trust, whether that's in systems and each other, because it feels to me like a very important feeling and I want to kind of explore that.
Yeah, it's a complicated word because it's been so overused. So, most of the time when we're talking about trust, we're actually talking about places where we lost trust, right? So, when I walk across the room, I don't think about the fact that I trust my feet and ankles and knees to get me across. The second I sprain my ankle or twist my knee, or my shoe falls off, or my toe gets stubbed, I begin to think about um, trust, right? I can't put my weight on this anymore. So that's one tricky thing about trust. But it's certainly something that I am dealing with in another way. So in my work, a lot of people who are working with coaching or with teaching or with psychology or with, lots of ways in which there have been downloadable methodologies for how to make change, right? I want to just point to the violence of even that term, change making, right? Who's making the change? The change is coming through. The change makes itself. So the issue that I am having here is that there is no trust in those processes of multi-contextual, trans-contextual movement to actually produce shiftings that you may not be able to recognize. So what we have is I'll believe it when I see it culture. But the only things we can actually perceive, are those things we are familiar with. Those ways of perceiving that are already grooved in. So you can say, I did this and my marriage changed. This, my friend, is not systemic work. Right? So if you're making a shift in the way you perceive the world, your marriage will definitely change, along with most of the rest of your life. Right? So if you're looking for systemic family therapy, what the hell is that? Right? And I work with systemic family therapists, but I'm just saying it's not outside of ecological, political, economic, educational, health systems. Like, you can't separate it. And that sense of how to practice being in the world in a way that allows for change to emerge requires trust in a way that it will. And the deep addiction is that you have to predetermine what your goals are, work toward them, strategize how you're going to get there. And the second you do that, you actually obscure and maybe even violate all the possibility that was brewing and bubbling in the complexity that you can no longer see because you're moving toward it. So I have often used the example of, the way, how deep this habit is. So we say the little itty bitty words, to and. Did we talk about this before in our last class? So before the factory became kind of like the model for the education system and vice versa, there was a different way of speaking in English and in many Western languages, where you would say something like, I'm going outside and picking peaches. I'm going to school and learning to read. I'm going to the market and buying grain. And when you say that, I'm going outside and going outside is a whole experience. All sorts of things are happening. And I'm going to pick peaches. So that's another one. There's two things and they're full of complexity. I'm going to school. Wow, all sorts of things are happening at school. And I'm learning to read, right? You see that? Now, what happened with the factory is that the efficiency, the optimization, the way in which we could make higher level productivity kicked in, and it stopped being and it became to. I'm going outside to pick peaches. And then it becomes, how fast did you get out there? How many peaches did you pick? How efficient were you? And if you came back with no peaches, you failed. Right? I'm going to school to learn to read. How fast did you learn to read? What level are you reading at? And if you don't learn to read, you failed. And this is part of the cost of this particular habituated thinking that does not trust that you could go to school and learn to read. And I'm using that one in particular because as parents, some of us are parents, it's nerve-wracking to have a kid who's not thriving in the existing standardized systems. And you begin to think, we have to get this kid up to snuff in this particular system because the way that they're learning to be a tomato is not measuring up. And that is, for me, that's where the trust thing is really needed right now. Is what does it mean to make ecological change? Not to make change, but to make the possibility of ecological change, things that are going to move. Like when you're doing systems change, like I said, you don't change anything because you're changing everything. And the way that the everything is changing is usually imperceptible to the habituated cognitive processes that are already grooved in on particular identifiable ways of making change. But the things we need to change we can't see them. And then I feel like if I say that I'm suddenly selling clothes to emperors. And, this is like, but what do you mean? Like, how do I know I'm getting anything for my money? How do you get a grant proposal for that? And there it is. It's like, well, if you're getting a grant proposal for something else, I can promise you it's not systemic work. It's just going to actually perpetuate the existing problems. And yeah.
Amen.
Trust.
Love that. Yes, I love that. And you know what came up for me is, and actually this is a new thought for me, which is why I love these conversations and I'm so grateful for them, is that, I've written a lot about the way the Western psyche developed, and people like Joseph Henrich at Harvard who've written about, weird Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic thinking. Part of what he points out is that we outsourced our trust into institutions. And I think now we outsource our trust into machines. And so in essentially what we've been taught is that the only thing you can really trust is quantity. You can only trust things that are quantifiable, like the airplane. It's not going to crash. because we know it's not going to crash because look, we've got all these checks and balances in place, and look at the statistics. It's safer than driving a car, right? And that movement away from trusting anything qualitative, people, processes, nature, reality itself, the unknown. I think there's some return to a trust and quality that feels for me really alive when I think about it. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is to encourage people to find the Alan Watts quote where he talks about music, because it ties directly to what you're saying, where he says, there is no point to music. The point to music is the music. In fact, there is no, but it's just it's the isness of it. And that if there was a point to music, like the factory, then whoever played the concerto the fastest would win, and they would get the the prize. It's a kind of ludicrous concept, but it's exactly, I think, touching on what you're pointing to. So I thought we might open to some questions and thoughts in our last sort of 20 minutes or so. And let me just check. We have a little spreadsheet going. Very good. Thank you, Nico. So let's see. What about Young? You had a question about Nora and warm data in her own life. Do you want to launch with that?
Yes, thank you. Damn. I feel like I want to ask Nora a question and I'm going to learn a lot.
Go for it.
Wow, I mean, it's so I don't I'm really at a loss with words. It's 3:55 a.m. here in Shenzhen, China, but I'm like my heartbeat is so intense and my upper body is completely buzzing. Um, damn. So I don't even know what's going to come out now. Nora, I want to really heartfelt thank you wholeheartedly. I asked you a question back in COVID times, during Rebel Wisdom in 2020. And I got so much out of that that it actually, your responses at the time actually kind of grew a life in me and around me and in between me and within me. Like, especially your metaphor, emphasis on the metaphor of the soil. I've been working as a teacher in a middle school, and I literally put it as my classes. I was a head teacher for a class of 50 students, and like I literally put as our class model, let's create a good soil together.
Mhm.
Yeah, I even put your photo on during a PTA meeting as well. And sort of that's the idea. I don't know how these more traditional Chinese parents took it. Is it Western propaganda? I don't know. But, like I can only say that I did that. Yeah, and so at that time, I asked you a question about a question that your daughter asked you about, like how can we see ourselves as a good person? How can we be a good person when everything we do is related to extraction and exploitation? And yeah, at that time, you really gave you actually you talked about trust, the trust that lies in between you and your daughter. And you use the words that, and which is a word that you don't usually use, that trust is sacred.
Mhm.
Like that your daughter can ask this question to you because she trusts that you won't just bullshit her. You won't
Mhm.
just give her, just go to school and to get good grades.
Yeah.
Like you're not gonna bullshit her with that. And that's because your father always kind of tells you, or like make a conscious effort to let you know that, like, oh, I was wrong about this and this and this. Like there's an embodiment of, like there's this constant learning and realizing one's, like wrongness and foolishness. So yeah, I'm just kind of, curious about how that relationship, that sacred trust in between you has evolved and, and how is that relationship, with all the soil within and, around you. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I find that this intergenerational learning, uh, is really I mean, I think that might be where evolution happens, right? In the sort of in between the generations, and the ways in which I, as a mother, present all these expectations, most of which, like the dream, are not spoken. Right? So most of the things we teach our kids are not the things that we set out to teach them. Most of the things we teach them are implicit. And so the depth of the systemic shift, of the intimacy in the complexity of noticing, what am I transmitting that's beyond words? I know when I say, we're learning to do this, or I want you to do that, or let me give you this piece of advice, that's super explicit. But what's in the implicit? What is there? So there was this one time when my daughter came up to me, I think she was like, I don't know, 15, 16. She was like, Mom, why did you do this to us? I was like, what are you talking about? She said, I walk in the living room and I look at how everybody's doing. How are they? Are they warm enough? Do they need tea? Are they happy? Are they okay? Is there something I can do for them? And she's like, and my brother walks in the room and he just wants to know where he should sit down. She was like, why did you train us to be like this? And I was like, I did not train you to be like that. And then I was like, yes, I did. I absolutely did. How did I do that? I have no idea how I did that, but I know that I did it. And so that is the piece when, in this intergenerational learning that is so profound of looking at these things. They're almost impulses that I don't even know I'm doing them. And yet I'm transmitting entire ways of behaving and thinking of identity and being in the world that I have no idea I'm transmitting.
Funny how that like training also has a gender differences though.
Well, gender differences, older, younger child differences, there's all sorts of stuff in there that is, you can find it in lots of families. But that it's that thing of thinking we can always do some kind of explicit, some sort of explicit change making. And I'm not saying that we can't do it ever, but I am saying watch out, because the deeper stuff is riding way below that waterline. And it's, it becomes insidious because it's below that waterline. You don't know that you're doing it, but there's been a kind of a coalescence of experiences that are manifesting and expressing through you that you don't know you're doing it. And those are the things that are the most profound in our analog communication changes.
That's
So
sorry, go on.
yeah, I was just going to say, for me, that's why I write poetry, because I find that prose can't get there. I wrote a poem about this. Can I read the poem?
Please.
Yes. Hell
Okay.
yeah.
All right. This one, Jan, this one's for you. So it's called Mama Now, and it's written for all the mamas and all the papas and the godmothers and the aunties and the grandparents and all of you. What it's like to be a mama now. Your eyes will see the derailing of assumptions. Your hands will hold the crumble of the old matrix. I do not have any authority to lean into. I have empty pockets where parents used to advise their children. I do not have any maps, myths, or mother wisdom for you. I can fix your breakfast, but not the culture. And when you ask how to be a good person, I cannot lie to you. Everything you touch in a day is in some way bloodied. You've been born into an edgeless violence. But I will not judge or measure you against a bygone metric. I'm here, too. ready to learn with you, unsure how to be or who to be. I can only read fragments of your worry, as the future is a horizon of confusion. I cannot protect you, and yet it is my only job. Aching as I witnessed from this side of the hourglass, other generations of parents knew the outlines: school, career, family, and retirement. But your life will be another shape entirely, forming in the fractures. And when you say you need a goal, I offer you an expired ticket. Superficial memes roll off the tongue right into your bullshit detector. Success in the existing system is not going to do you much good. Your integrity is your rage, and I will nourish it. Your dignity is your curiosity, and I am tiny beside it. Your courage is your pain, and I will sing to it with you. We will riot together. We will notice the nuance of small graces in the day. We will wash the grit of loss for each other. I am your mama, and your future is the story of a storm. I am your cabin, your boots, your rucksack.
Hallelujah.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Nora. That was perfect. And I feel, without putting you on the spot, Leslie, um, I think it would be lovely to hear from a great mother next. And Leslie, you've put a few things in the chat, but there was this really lovely question that was in one of them, which I've just put in the chat. And if you don't feel called to ask that, if you have something else that's coming up for you, please ignore it. But I just thought that might be helpful. But yeah, if you're up for it, it'd be nice to hear from you.
Oh boy. I'm in tears from that poem, Nora, and I would love a copy, if there's some way to
It's in here,
book. Okay, excellent.
but
Yeah,
I can also send a copy to Allie to send to you guys.
yeah, yeah. That would be wonderful. Thank you. My question, let's see, what was it I asked? Um, I think it was about trust. Was it how to live and function in a current worldview while also holding the larger living, ever-changing, evolving world? I guess that's what it takes the most. That's what takes the most trust. A trust that we can survive this reductive world while also being a part of its evolution. And it's like how, really leaning into and absorbing and embodying your work, Nora, around warm data and around how systems learn and are alive. Almost, I wonder, how do we march through the day to day, function, operate, pay the bills, do the things, run our businesses? Um, you know, I guess it's being in the world but not of it, while wanting to be a part of birthing something new that is yet completely unknown.
Mhm.
I think I'll just stop there.
I mean, I think, yeah, well, I hear you completely. And people use that metaphor of, building a new ship while you're at sea sort of thing. And there's also, and every moment is actually a moment of practice, of perceiving whatever it is you're doing, and perceiving it in its multi-contextual relational process. And sometimes those perceptions are perceptions of some kind of extractive, exploitative violence. And sometimes those perceptions are perceptions of vitality itself in process. And the practice, though, is the same. And so this, that for me is, to go into whatever, a shop and just get the groceries is an incredible multi-contextual set of relationships in culture, with seasons, with all kinds of transportation, with agriculture, with exploitation of people who have been farmers or who are picking fruits or who are with the possibility of making recipes that cross generations. So in the grocery store is all of it. And that is, I think, the practice. That's the practice. That's the thing, is that when you can go in there and you can begin to see all the ways in which that grocery store is destroying possibilities for life, and all the ways in which it's actually generating the conditions for life, for picking that beautiful pepper and making that beautiful soup for someone that's sick, or for your own body, or for making a birthday cake. And there's the whole cultural piece of birthday cakes. So no matter what you do, it's all there. All of the beauty and all of the destruction. And so for me, I think that's how we do it, is that we become increasingly familiar with practice of perceiving those relational communicational processes in their ugliness and destruction, and in their beauty and in their sacred grace, both. Because it's only by being able to perceive the differences between them that we can begin to actually move and respond in different ways.
Thank you. Yeah. I can feel the old way of thinking even just in my question,
Mm.
right? Compared to this new way of thinking, which feels so much better to my system. Yeah.
It's alive even when, because you could get into this thing, I grew up in California in the 70s, and, you were only supposed to have positive thoughts. That was a really weird time. Or not generate fear, or, all of those things. But I mean, at this point, it's like, if we are not able to perceive the intricacies of the complexity and the movement that we're in, our responses are going to be inadequate. And so the practice is there in every moment, when when you're with your dog and you're in communication with your dog, when you're with your kids and you're in communication with your kids, when you're on the bus. Like, there's no moment that's not the moment to practice.
Beautiful.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, Leslie, I feel you in that. Like, I, I'm deeply immersed in complexity and, psychedelic sort of complexity and all the weirdness. And then the other day, I was actually walking the dog, funnily enough, and I realized I was just like looking out at the world in a very sort of granular, reductionist kind of, everything's in its own particular pieces. And I noticed it and thought, that's how we've been trained. Like, that's how we've grown up. That's how we've been programmed. So we got to be also understanding with ourselves that we have a particular mindset, which has a lot of benefits as well. And there's a lot of benefits to an individualist mindset that can break things apart. And I think the process that many of us are on is trying to find a way to do an and go, and what? I'm in a reductionist mindset and I'm in a complexity mindset. What does that look like? What does that feel like? That's certainly my process quite often. I notice myself beating myself up, being like, I know it's all connected. Why am I seeing it like this? And then I have to catch myself and say, yeah, because I've been trained in that particular way. So we're just
And that's why we need each other, Ellie.
Yes, beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
there's this way in which the reminding of each other is super important, because when you have a bad day and somebody does a thing, or the heater breaks, or the new president like cancels all the federal grants, you can get really blamey. really, break things down and respond in ways that are not coming from the place that is going to produce the tomatoes. And I just want to point out language-wise, there's a real difference between the individual and individuating and isolating.
Mm.
And it's the isolation that's the problem.
Mm.
And so I think that I think hopefully that helps
That's
to
a
hold.
really important distinction, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that in. Thank you. Great. So Nora, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom. It's been a really lovely session. And Daniel Pinchbeck, you're actually here. In fact, Daniel is tomorrow at the
Ah,
same time. So Daniel, don't know if you want to say a quick hello. There you are. Great.
Yeah.
How you feeling? What's up?
A little sleepy today. Hopefully tomorrow afternoon I'm more fast awake.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to it, and I'm going to be asking you exactly the same question. Where do we go from here? And I think we'll have an equally rich, but probably very different conversation as well. You know, perhaps more on the political level.
No.
But I'm looking forward to it.
Well, me too. It'll be great to chat tomorrow. Good
Yeah.
to see everyone. Yeah.
Nice.
Ali, do you want me to read one more poem real
I
quick?
would. That would be such a lovely way to
Okay,
close. Please
then we'll
do.
close.
Yeah.
Nice
Yeah,
to
yeah,
see you,
beautiful.
Daniel. But this one, I think this is sort of where you started today. It's called How Do You Pack? I do not long for how things were before, nor do I long for some fabricated future utopia. I do not long for things or money or status. I do not long for more time or even for fixing the broken corners of my heart. I feel the upending of so much that has needed to be upended for so long, but I do not long for the chaos. It comes like a fever to a sick body. I do not know what a healthy system would be like. I do not know how to long for it. How do you pack when you have no idea where you're going? So I'll leave you with that one.
Oh, beautiful. How do you pack when you have no idea where you're going? That pretty much sums up this entire endeavor. So thank you, Nora. Great. So everyone, thank you guys for coming. Really feeling great that we're developing community again like this. Please unmute yourselves if you fancy it and do our traditional goodbye and thank you to Nora, and I'll see you tomorrow with Daniel.
Thank you, Ali. And thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Nora.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Nora.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you
Thanks
so
all.
much.
Be happy, tomatoes.